Hi, my name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Museum Open House. This ongoing series features and highlights many of the outstanding museums and other cultural institutions. The main purpose of most programs is to inform viewers about current and upcoming exhibits, various programs, resources, and other opportunities that are available for the general public. Today, via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guests Garrett Dash Nelson and Kathryn Lasdow. Garrett is the president and head curator at the Norman B. Leventhal Map Center, located in the Boston Public Library, and Kathryn is the director of public history and assistant professor of history at Suffolk University. Together, they curated the fascinating exhibition that's currently on display at the Leventhal Map Center entitled Terrains of Independence. Rather than presenting the revolution as solely a political or ideological event, the exhibition highlights how local terrain, social tensions, economic geography, and environmental factors shaped the conditions that led to revolutionary upheaval. During the program, you'll hear why and how the exhibition came about. We'll go on a behind-the-scenes tour, and in the process, come to better understand and appreciate a more nuanced understanding of the American Revolution, shaped by people, land, and power. Let's start by meeting Garrett and Katie, and then finding out all about Terrains of Independence. Welcome. So delighted you're both able to be here.
Thanks for
Thank you
having
for
us,
having us.
Jay.
I had the wonderful opportunity to visit the exhibition a few days ago, learned a lot as always, eager to find out more and have you inform viewers. To that end, Garrett, would you please start by sharing just why and how the exhibition came about?
Sure. Thanks, Jay. And again, thanks for having us here. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. We started thinking about an exhibition about the American Revolution years ago, with the goal of coinciding with the 250th anniversaries that are taking place this year and next year. The Leventhal Center had done an exhibition about the American Revolution back in 2016, taking a big picture view of the entire revolutionary moment. We didn't want to simply duplicate that exhibition, and we also wanted to tell a slightly different story about what you can do with maps in history. We wanted to take the maps not just as objects in and of themselves, but instead use them to reframe our understanding of the why and how of familiar historical events. So Terrains of Independence really zooms in on Boston and tries to take a geographic approach to the historical question, why did so many of the early events in the Revolutionary War happen here in Boston and Massachusetts?
And how did the two of you go about curating the exhibition?
We're really lucky to have so many amazing scholars at our doorstep in Boston. I joke that although the exhibition itself tries to be not boost up Boston too much, in the present day, we have such an amazing array of folks to draw on and expertise to draw on near to us. Dr. Lasdow is a faculty member at Suffolk University and an amazing public historian, as well as somebody who thinks really carefully and thoughtfully about geography's role in the American past. So Katie and I had the opportunity to work together. I'm, of course, familiar with the Leventhal Center's collection. Katie is familiar with the 18th century to put this exhibition together.
And Katie, what led to the approach of focusing on terrain there rather than people and ideas that most of us are very familiar with, especially when talking about the revolution locally in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the things that we really set out to do was move away from the traditional story that centers folks that we know of, like George Washington or Paul Revere, and instead ask, what can talking about a specific place tell us that perhaps a biography cannot? And I think when we think about the American Revolution in Boston as a story of terrains rather than ideas or people, we can really start to move beyond that familiar narrative of Boston as some kind of cradle of liberty and instead focus on the geographic factors that shaped the revolution. And as Garrett mentioned before, maps are wonderful storytelling devices because they really help us get at the where questions of revolutionary history. It's no longer
Mm.
simply, just the Boston Massacre happened, but rather the Boston Massacre happened in this specific location. And therefore, that location helps shape people's understanding of that event in popular memory when it happened, but also in our kind of pop cultural understanding today. So, geography really helps us take these events and really think about them spatially in a way that is really fun to think about.
For sure, for sure. For those who haven't had the chance to visit yet, could you give us an overview of how you and Garrett went about designing, laying out the exhibition?
Sure. So we made the decision pretty early on to frame the exhibition around a series of geographic scales, starting with the broad sweeping scale of empire, and then gradually getting smaller, moving to the region of New England, to the city of Boston, to the tiniest local landmark, and then zooming back out again at the war's end to focus on the idea of nation, so the United States immediately after the war. And visitors can move through the exhibition along these series of scales, beginning with the expansiveness of the British Empire in the 18th century, and then progressing gradually ever smaller. I think one of the ways that this kind of scalar approach really helps in terms of thinking about the geography of the war is that we can start to really consider the ways in which when we reorient our place in this concept of where we are on the map, we
Mm.
can really kind of get at events in different ways. And one of the things that I like to think about as a curator is I try to let my storytelling be motivated by the objects themselves. So, in this case, primarily maps, and really try to think about how the kind of curatorial process is guided by the stories that the objects tell rather than going in with some kind of predetermined narrative of the story that I want to tell. And the significance of the American Revolution that started to emerge from these maps is really tied to some of the decisions that map makers themselves are making about the information to include or omit from a map, what details to
Mm.
emphasize, what geographic relationships to highlight. And so we can really start to think differently about how we think about the historical complexity of the American Revolution from how we choose to interpret these maps at each individual scale.
Interesting, the last point or so you made there, how the map maker's intention reminds me of the famous Paul Revere lithograph of the Boston Massacre and how that can be interpreted several different ways.
Absolutely. Yeah, Paul Revere, he does make one appearance in the exhibition. And when we talk about landmarks, he actually he drew an array of different kinds of lithographs and drawings and sketches of different aspects of the Revolutionary War. And we do highlight a drawing of an obelisk that he captured that didn't stand for very long, but it does stand, so to speak, on paper.
How did you go about acquiring the different maps and materials that accompany the exhibition?
Sure. Well, the majority of the items on display are originals from the Leventhal Map Center's
Mm.
collections. Most of those items are the ones that are featured primarily on the walls in frames or in the cases. Sometimes we decided that a map was too spectacular to keep in a smaller format, that we really wanted to blow it out so that visitors and our education team could really work with it. And in a couple places, we have large reproduction floor maps that people can really explore up close. And we also were able to partner with the City of Boston's archaeological department. In the landmark section of the exhibition, we have a case that includes a series of archaeological artifacts excavated across the city of Boston from revolutionary sites
Yeah.
that help tell each scalar story of the exhibition. So, for example, a spoon with a relief of one of the King Georges as a way to talk about empire, or a pottery sherd featuring the dome of the new Massachusetts State House as a way to talk about nation. So it was a really neat opportunity to kind of combine the maps with the material culture to really get at these stories in a deeper way.
Another wonderful feature, speaking of collaboration, that I really appreciated is how you work together with the Boston schools, Boston Latin, and Northeastern to enhance the exhibition so well.
Yeah, we always try to, weave in perspectives, that are not limited to our kind of curatorial team. So our education team worked with two high school students from BPS to annotate a really interesting city scale map of Boston from the period right before the war broke out. And the students looked at features on that map, matched it to a modern map, and used as a way to think about how the past is still very much with us in the built environment of Boston. And then a graduate course that I led at Northeastern did a really cool tie-in digital project that kind of grappled with the question of, or the challenge, I guess, of recognizing that Copley Square itself is not a very interesting site for the American Revolution. So where the Central Library sits was tidal flats in the 18th century. There wasn't a lot of
Mm.
action or protest in those tidal flats. So the graduate students' digital tours take us out elsewhere to familiar and unfamiliar sites where actually kind of being in the landscape helps you think about what was going on, what were those terrains of the moment.
Yeah, again, just a wonderful addition to the overall exhibition. Katie, what advice or tips maybe would you give, especially first-time visitors, to engage in the concept of terrain to appreciate it as much as they could?
Sure. I mean, the first thing I would say is I hope that they just come and they enjoy and they feel welcome and encouraged to really look closely at the maps to get as close as possible to the images that they see around them and really study them up close. I mean, even Garrett and I continue to every time we're in the gallery, we notice something new that we didn't notice before, and we hope that visitors feel really welcome to join us in that process of discovery. I hope that visitors leave with a deeper understanding of the why, for why Boston became so important to the geography of the war, that it helps them think about their city or the place that they're visiting in new ways, and where it fits in the broader place-based story of the war itself.
I think that's a great point about visiting and touring the exhibition, because it's sort of like an art museum in a way. I know I have a tendency, I think I've slowed down a little bit to try to see everything in the exhibition. The same with maps, as you're saying, you really have, there's so much information. Take your time and not feel obligated to see every single thing
Mhm.
during your stay, but get as much out of whatever limited amount you're able to see on a visit as possible, for sure.
Absolutely. And visitors don't need to move chronologically. They're more than welcome to, and the scales in some ways do end up playing out in kind of a chronological fashion. But we really did try to work hard to make it so that visitors could really dip a toe in at any point in the exhibition that felt interesting to them, and be able to follow the thread, and feel that they could ground themselves in the spaces that we were talking about around them.
Are marginalized perspectives shown throughout some of the maps?
Yes, and in fact, one place where we focus on this quite in detail is a map called the Seat of War of New England. I'm not sure if this is a good point to pull up a map for us to see,
Let's
but
do that.
that would be a fun one to look at up close.
I'll be sharing some images that come from the digital companion to Terrains of Independence. This digital companion has essentially all of the material in the exhibition, all of the text, deep zoomable images into all of the collections. And so always the best thing to do is to come see the show in person, but this digital exhibition is a great way to experience it, even from your own cell phone while you're riding the train. So let's pull up the seat of war in New England. Here it is.
Wonderful. Now, I love this map because it is one of the only maps in the exhibition that features human figures apart from the cartouche.
Hmm.
And if you look really carefully and closely at this map, you'll see a number of different military movements and troop gatherings depicted
Oh,
on this map. And as Garrett has highlighted here, out near Worcester, you see George Washington's name, the only person named on this map,
wow.
um, marching west from the western part of the state to the city of Boston. Elsewhere on the map, you'll see troops coming down from New Hampshire. You see an inset map showing the Battle of Bunker Hill. And at each of these places, even though we can't know for certain if the folks depicted on this map, aside from George Washington, are meant to represent real people, and I think we can, with some confidence say, no, they're not meant to represent real people aside from George Washington. They're meant to be representative of a collection of people. We do know, historically speaking, that in many of these groups, there were people of color, indigenous folks, Black soldiers joining the fight for independence, both on the American and British sides of the war. And so we really used this map as an opportunity to showcase their contributions to the revolutionary story, to once again move beyond simply talking about George Washington, instead try to get down to the names and the stories of the people who were there on the ground fighting in the battles.
What are one or two other either standout or maybe surprising maps on display?
Sure. I think one of the things that surprised us most recently, like I said, Garrett and I are still uncovering things as we go through the gallery. I think one of the things that surprised both of us is the map of the state of Massachusetts immediately after the war that shows a kind of geographic, yes, exactly, a geographic reorientation of the map maker and by extension, the people looking at this map of Boston and Massachusetts' place in the wider world. If you were to start the exhibition back in the Empire section, we talk a lot about how in the 18th century, Boston sat on the western edge of the British Empire. But with the war's end and the establishment of the United States, Massachusetts and Boston are now on the eastern edge of a new
Hmm.
independent American republic. And one of the tiny details that surprised us in this map, yes, Garrett knows exactly where to go, is right up at the top, you see two longitude descriptions, one charting east from Washington and one
Hmm.
charting west from London. So there you see, just in this map alone, that kind of geographic reorientation happening on the page.
You know, now that you've worked on this, it's on display. How might this exhibition influence the way we teach and learn about the American Revolution or perhaps other historical events in school?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, as we've said a few times, that one of the things that we hope that the Terrains exhibition does is really showcase the importance of understanding the where of the American Revolution alongside the why and the how. We really can't understand why the war mattered unless we understand where all of those events were taking place, how people related to those spaces, and how people made critical decisions about the steps they wanted to take based on where they were in relationship to geographic factors. A person's sense of what it meant to even participate in the American Revolution, whether as a supporter or as a loyalist to the crown, was contingent on their relationship to institutions of power, to each other, to sites of commerce. And one of the things that we really tried to highlight throughout the exhibition is that a person's decision-making power there was really contingent on who they were. So a soldier's perspective was different from a married white woman's perspective, was different from an enslaved person's perspective, an indigenous person's perspective, and so on. And, those contingencies are all, tied into how those maps were made and how we can read them today. And I really do hope that an exhibition like this one pushes us to think more deeply about the complex ways that people were making decisions about their place in the future of the nation.
One thing
Garrett,
I might briefly add, Jay, is, I think one of the insights of this exhibition is to really encourage people to get out of the maps that are in their head. So when
Mm.
I say the words American Revolution, probably the first map that jumps into anybody's head is the familiar modern outline of the United States, right? And that outline, of course, is totally inconsequential in the 18th century, not only because that version of the United States doesn't even take shape until the middle of the 20th century, but because the people who were involved in this war from all different perspectives didn't know that they were creating this new nation, right? And they certainly didn't know that they were creating the nation that we would kind of have a map of 250 years later. So, if you were an indigenous person coming to Boston, seeing your ancestral territories get sliced across by foreign, unfamiliar border lines, if you were an enslaved person that was part of the trade and plantation economy that connected Boston to the Caribbean, to London, if you were a legislator in Massachusetts, right? The places that were relevant to you, that were shaping your world, and that you thought you were either fighting for or against, or that were becoming kind of emerging in your minds as the new territories of a new independent country, were totally different than the ones that we're familiar with today. So we have to kind of set aside our contemporary understanding of space and geography and try to get back to what geography felt like to people at the time.
Garrett, what related programming supports the exhibition?
One major initiative that has been in place both before and will continue after this exhibition is a partnership we have with the Washington Library at Mount Vernon in Virginia. The project is called American Revolutionary Geographies Online, or ARGO. It's
Mm.
funded in part by a grant from the United States National Archives. And ARGO is really meant to provide a window into dozens of institutions' map collections about this period. For instance, Katie and I, it was a great curatorial tool in that we had thousands of maps from many different institutions kind of at our fingertips when we were thinking about what we would put in the show and what resources we would use. But Argo, which you can visit at argomaps.org, is not just a map collection, it's also a kind of interpretive portal for many of these same themes about the historical geography of the period, of course, at a much broader scale than Massachusetts itself. While the exhibition is up, which is through March of 2026, we at the Leventhal Center will be running programming. We have activities for students. We have teacher professional development that will be revolving around this theme.
In closing, I'd be interested to hear if there's anything either of you learned about the role of place from curating and maybe even observing visitors go through the exhibition. Katie?
Sure. That's a really, really great question. And I think the thing that has surprised me the most is the kind of fluidity of place, that how people understood what a place looked like or what the geographic boundaries were was really dependent on a bunch of different factors that could not always be measured by, say, surveyors' tools or charted mathematically on a map. That sometimes those choices were very much artistic or geopolitical or social, and maps can really help us see all of those things, but they can also help us visualize things that people didn't yet know. So like Garrett was mentioning, they did not yet know that the United States lay in the future. And in some cases, we see that they did not yet know how they would depict or categorize the locations of indigenous nations across the continent. So it's always really interesting to kind of see how different map makers are thinking about those sort of uh, squiggy boundaries of where to
Nice.
place things on a map.
Mhm. Garrett?
One of the themes that I find really fascinating in this show, and that I'll confess I wasn't particularly familiar with until I started getting into scholarship and literature on this on the period was the way that places kind of became the sites of political consensus building at a variety of scales. So you think about, not everybody, and even in Boston or in Massachusetts, occupied the same social class and certainly didn't occupy the same political orientation towards the British Empire. So when you think about, for instance, merchant capital and dock workers in Boston, those are two very different types of people, but they're sharing space, they're coming together, they're seeing protest and violence happen in a very, tight geography of the historic city. There's also a really interesting story about how urban Boston and the still quite rural towns around it, like Concord and Lexington, kind of came into a political coalition with one
Hmm.
another. Today we think about, oh yeah, Concord's Lexington, that's basically part of Boston. But those were pretty different worlds in the 1770s. So you see these moments where, you know, there are some people who are on the leading edge of political rebellion and have particular self-interest in protesting or going into, outright revolutionary activity against the British. Others that are more skeptical and need to be brought into that coalition. And you kind of see how those formations take place in Massachusetts, and that becomes one of the answers to the question, why did it happen in Massachusetts as opposed to anywhere else in the British Empire? There were some unique features about Massachusetts and about the area around Boston that allowed those political formations to happen.
Wonderful, wonderful. In closing, Garrett, how can viewers and others stay informed about various activities, upcoming developments at the Map Center?
Yeah, we encourage visitors to come visit us at the Central Library in Copley Square. We're open every day of the week except for Monday, free to the public. Our website at leventhalmap.org has much more information about our programs and exhibitions, as well as links to the digital companion exhibitions. You can subscribe to our newsletter at leventhalmap.org/subscribe or follow us on social media at BPL Maps.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the program. I want to thank both of you so much again for taking the time to be here. Congratulations on another outstanding exhibition, Terrains of Independence. Definitely encourage people to make their way to the Boston Public Library to enjoy it and learn a lot, especially new perspective. Continued success with future endeavors.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jay. It's a pleasure to be here.
Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.